It's always a big question, how were the books of the Bible selected to be included in the Bible? And sometimes I'm asked, well, what about the books that were taken out of the Bible? My answer is going to be referring to the New Testament. The Old Testament was put together by the Jews long before Christ, but the areas of controversy are not Old Testament books, they are the New Testament books. And the controversy really was been stirred up primarily when Dan Brown wrote the book, the Vinci Code, in which he argued that it was a big political conspiracy that caused us to see Jesus a certain way, and as a result of a vote, books that presented Jesus differently were all burnt, and books that presented Jesus as we see him today were only kept because they passed a political manipulation test. Well, it's not quite accurate. The books of the Bible, the 27 books of the New Testament, were widely accepted by the early Christians from the first century on. They were passed about, and midway through the second century, there were attempts made to figure out, well, which books really were of the Scripture and which weren't. These attempts finally came to their completion towards the end of the 4th century. And most of the books, there was not much controversy about them because they gathered together, and it wasn't just a vote or which ones do I like or which ones say the things I like what they say. But when they tried to figure what books belonged in the Scripture, they had 3 criteria. Number 1, is this book written by an apostle or someone affirmed by one of the apostles? That was the biggest criteria because Jesus had chosen the apostles. And they understood that the 12 and then later Paul were the ones to give us the faith. Secondly, they asked, did the early church understand and accept this? And so the books that we have in the New Testament were referred to often by the early Christians in their writings. And so they looked for historical evidence that the early Christians accepted these books. And thirdly, they asked, is it in agreement with the doctrine of the rest of the books that we know are in the Scripture? With those 3 criteria of the 27 books in the New Testament, there's very little controversy about any of them. 22 of them, hardly any controversy whatsoever. The Gospels were accepted from the very beginning. Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, these central books that give us the theology of the New Testament were widely accepted. There was some question about Hebrews because they weren't sure who wrote it. There's some question about 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, because they were shorter books, and again, the John books were so short they wondered, are these really doctrine? There's some question about Revelation because it was so allegorical in nature. Still, in the end, they agreed these were from an apostle, had the credibility of the early church, and were in agreement with other doctrine. They belonged in Scripture. The books that were allegedly kept out refer to what we call the Gnostic religion. Gnosticism was a kind of like what we call a New Age religion today, very contrary to Christianity, and the books of the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament, condemned and rejected Gnosticism, particularly Paul in the book of Colossians and John in the book of 1 John. They condemned Gnosticism. And yet Gnosticism, as Jesus grew in influence into the 2nd century, they wanted him as well. And so they began to write books that talked about Jesus as if he was a Gnostic. These books did not begin to show up until midway into the 2nd century, over 100 years after Jesus had died, and over the next 100 or 200 years. This is why they never established the credibility of being by an apostle, accepted by the earliest church, or in agreement with other doctrine. And these books never were accepted by the church. They've never even been pretended to be until the last 50 or 60 years that they were purported that ever they should, but they were never part of the early church belief, and that's why it's not that they were taken out of the Bible. Truth is, they were never, ever in the Bible.